Hello, my name is Paige Ziegler, and I'm the chair of the Waldo County Democratic Committee. We at the WCDC are bringing this conversation to you because we feel that voters need to know just how politics affect their economic and physical well-being so they can make wise decisions when voting. On June 8th in Belfast, Garrett Martin spoke to us about the misinformation that this administration, is using to hide the transfer of wealth from the vast majority of Americans to the very wealthy. I would like to introduce Garrett Martin from the Maine Center for Economic Policy. A generation removed from poverty, Garrett made his way to Maine after working in community economic development in the Mississippi Delta, Southern India, and Latin America. As president and CEO of the Maine Center for Economic Policy, he pairs rigorous economic analysis with deep commitment to economic justice, driving successful efforts to boost incomes, expand health care access, and ensure every Mainer has a fair shot at a good life. A Moorhead and Truman Scholar, Garrett holds a master's in public affairs from Princeton University with a focus on economics and public policy. He served on the Community Development Advisory Committee of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and he taught graduate courses in community economic development at the University of Southern Maine. Outside of policy work, Garrett coaches high school cross country and track, mentoring nearly 100 teens in his community each year, and was recognized as Maine Coach of the Year in 2017. And Garrett will now open his conversation.
So really appreciate the invitation, appreciate that you all are here on a really amazing day outside, which given the May we've had is a true testament to either you being gluttons for punishment or truly having no life at all. So I'm glad you'll spend it with me because I have no life at all. No, in all seriousness, obviously these are really important issues that we're going to talk about today. I am cognizant again of your time, and what I'd like to do is do a little bit of tax policy 101 just to set the stage and then really get into the meat of I think why we're here. And fundamentally why we're here is going back to the Maine Center for Economic Policy's mission. We are about making sure that everyone has a fair shot at a good life. And it turns out that one of the ways that we do that as a nation and as a state is through our tax policy. Our tax policy represents our highest aspirations. Think about investments in our education systems and our communities. Our tax policy informs what's possible in our economy, and even, as we are all too aware now, affects what's possible in our democracy and what we can expect from our democracy. So, as Paige said, I'm a generation removed from poverty. I do come at some of these issues from that perspective in the sense that, yes, I am your resident economic policy wonk. I have my four-colored pen, but also really appreciative of the fact that at the end of the day, these issues make a difference in people's lives. And my father is a perfect example of what it means to have a tax policy that works. He grew up in rural North Carolina. He was lucky enough to go to a public school where he had a high school chemistry teacher who saw his potential. And it was that high school chemistry teacher who encouraged him to apply to college, but more importantly, helped him secure a scholarship from his local Elks Lodge for $2,000 to go to Fiar College, a very small rural college in North Carolina. And it was because of that that he ultimately went on to get his medical degree as an ophthalmologist. He served in the military for a few years, and then I subsequently benefited from that and grew up in rural North Carolina and rural Virginia. So that is, I think, one thing that's just important to acknowledge, that without the kinds of investments that we talk about, there are a lot of people that could get left behind. And quite frankly, that is what is happening now. And we are on the precipice of supercharging some of those realities for all too many people. So, we're going to talk about Tax Policy 101. Going to talk a little bit about the state of play. You may have heard there's this big bill happening in DC. We're going to talk about its implications for Maine specifically, and then ideally what folks can do about it, right? Because that's, I think, ultimately why we're here. The bottom line is, I used to play Monopoly with my older brothers, and some of you all have heard this story before, and I could never beat them. I never beat them. And I would go and I would play at my neighbor's and at my friend's house, and I would try to do something that my brothers taught me, this is how the rules work in Monopoly. And my friends would say, no, you can't do it that way. That's not the way the game is played. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, those aren't the rules. I was like, well, this is the way we always play at home. And they said, you've been completely hoodwinked. And so what I realized is that obviously the rules were rigged long before I came along playing Monopoly with my brothers, by my brothers. And at the end of the day, I didn't have a fair shot. I never did at the game of Monopoly until I went and played with my friends who actually did play by the rules. So I think the point of that is we all have a role in structuring the rules of how our economy works. It is not something that we are just passengers to. It is something that we have an active opportunity and, I would argue, obligation to engage in a more effective manner. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in on Tax Policy 101. And I just want to acknowledge at the outset, I think you all have already figured this out, this is being recorded, which is interesting. But I think it's great, and I'm hopeful certainly that folks who ultimately choose to watch this on their own time will benefit from it as well. But for those of you in the room, don't hesitate to shout out questions. I will do my best to repeat them so that they're recorded for posterity's sake. But certainly help me out along the way if there's any questions or if you're sort of ready for me to move along, okay? We good? We got 3.5 hours, I hear. This is going to be great. All right, here we go. So how income taxes work. I think it's really interesting because, you know, I could have started this in a different place. But what I increasingly come to realize, and I'm realizing it this past weekend, because for the last several days, we've actually been in conversations with lawmakers in Augusta about changes we might make to our tax code. And it turns out in those conversations, we've had some very revealing revelations, which is that there's some basics that we all should understand about how the tax code works, because understanding that is really important to then thinking about how you might fix it. So, basic number one. First thing you got to do is figure out what your taxable income is. Now, I think we all know this, but what I think a lot of people forget is when you talk about we're going to tax income, most people automatically default to, oh, they're taxing all my income, right? But it turns out if you take the amount of money you earn through work, in this case, and then you separate, you take away the standard deduction or the itemized deduction, and in the tax code in 2024, the standard deduction for a married couple was $24,900, right? So if you were someone who was making $150,000, what that would mean is that you weren't paying taxes on all $150,000. You're paying taxes on $150,000 minus $29,200, right? Which then means you're actually paying taxes on $120,000 and $120,800, right? So that's one piece. The other thing that's interesting is there are some other deductions and adjustments. So my mother is legally blind. It turns out there's an additional adjustment for people who are legally blind. There are some adjustments for people who have other disabilities. And then for itemizers, the big one there is people's mortgage, right? So the reality is 90% of people claim the standard deduction. The 10% that don't tend to be high net worth individuals. And so when we look at, for instance, the tax proposal that's coming out of the Congress now, one of the big sticking points is for Republicans in Democratic states where they've chosen to make more investments in their public services, and therefore those people have state and local taxes that they're paying more of. And those have been deductible historically. But when they did the Trump tax plan before, they actually reduced the level at which they were deductible. And these Republicans in these blue states are saying, wait a second, you're hurting my constituents, you're hurting my folks. We need to think about how we make that more available to residents in my state. But it turns out that most of those residents are wealthy people too. So they're advocating for wealthy people. Yes?
Aren't many of the Democratic politicians in those states concerned about that as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, Democrats and Republicans alike are going to be looking out for their constituents, right? And it's a really interesting topic. I could go down a tributary here, but I won't, which is a really interesting conversation between people in the labor movement and people outside the labor movement, sort of progressive tax policy people, because the labor movement folks are saying, wait a second, these higher taxes at the state and local level are actually purchasing goods and services that are good for our communities, are good for our state, are good for our state employees. And if you're trying to penalize people for our increase in taxes, then you're actually creating a disincentive to make those investments. So we'll come back to that if you want more, but I'll blow through here. So first thing, you got to figure out how much income you have, right? Second thing is you apply the tax rates to the various income levels. So the lowest income tax bracket is 10%. So the first $11,600 of income gets taxed at 10%. You with me? The next bracket is at $47,160. And so that gets, this is for a married couple, that gets taxed at 12%. And then on you go. There are 3 more brackets above this. So for the married couple earning $150,000, what that means is that they are paying $22,035 or $22,035 in taxes. Where's that coming from? Well, they pay $1,600, 10% on this first $11,000, right? Then in this next group, at the 12% level, they're paying roughly $4,300 and so on until you get to a total of $22,000. Now what's important here is one of the things that we're running into in Maine right now is there's a concern for how can we cut taxes for lower and middle income households. So how do we give lower and middle income households a break? Well, what do you think the first thing most people will say we should do? Well, let's reduce these rates down at this end, right? Intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. But in terms of tax policy, there's this very bizarre thing that happens, which is, sure, you lower the rates down here, but that means everybody else above gets a break, right? And more often than not, this is the top of the bracket. So it turns out that somebody who's got taxable income of $47,160, let's say they're married, that means they're earning closer to $65,000, right? But if they're earning less than that, they don't get the full benefit of that reduced rate. But everybody else above them does. And so that's a really interesting conundrum. Now, it turns out that there are programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, that help target tax relief to individuals and families at the lower and middle income levels. And that's effectively what we've done in our tax code. So in Maine, when Governor LePage came into office, it was very interesting. There was an effort to reduce our income taxes. At the same time that happened, we improved our Earned Income Tax Credit and our Child Tax Credit such that just by filing their taxes, low-income people were recouping as much as $1,700 through the tax code. So at the same time that they were cutting programs to provide access to health care and food assistance in our Department of Health and Human Services, we were building these credits into our tax code that at least were helping to put money back in people's pockets. Now, when we talk about the bill before Congress, one of the big issues, and this is going to play out in a huge way for Maine people, is the premium tax credit. So these are tax credits that households get when they purchase health care on the health insurance marketplace. And so for a family of 4 earning, let's say, $62,000 a year, the value of this tax credit reduces their cost of health insurance by about $200 a month. That's a lot, right? And currently, those are slated to go away at the end of this year, which means people are going to lose their ability to pay for their health insurance. Another example here, and this is actually this one sort of blows my mind, quite frankly. A 62-year-old couple who's earning $82,000 a year is currently paying about $608 a month in their health insurance premiums, thanks in part to the premium tax credit. If those tax credits go away, the cost of health insurance for that household will go up to $2,300 a month. Yeah. And there hasn't been a lot of coverage of this in the media, but it is one that will really leave a lot of working class people high and dry in this process. Okay, so you got the basics here, right? You got to figure out how much income, you've got to apply it to your rates and your brackets, and then whatever credits you get at the end of the day, bada bing, bada boom, pay your taxes. Yes?
So is that principally of concern to people before they retire, or is it across the board?
The premium tax credits? It's across the board. I think, I don't have the precise number off the top of my head, but I want to say it's something like 190,000 people in Maine are getting their health insurance through the marketplace. 84% of those people are benefiting from some form of the premium tax credit. So you can see that's not a small number. And again, these are people who earn too much to qualify for Medicaid, and they're not old enough to be on Medicare. So really the only way they're able to afford a decent health plan is in part because of these tax credits, right? So that's definitely a big deal. Okay, so we're going to go up to Tax 201 real quick, and I love the questions, keep them coming. So when we talk about taxes in general, you'll hear sort of progressive, proportional, regressive tax structures come out. So a progressive tax structure is one in which as your income level rises, you actually pay more in taxes as a share of your income. Now most people say, this is maybe okay, right? Where a lot of people sort of initially go to, though, is a proportional system, where everybody pays the same rate across the board, right? And you'll hear states and people talk about, oh, if we just had a flat tax, that would be more fair. You ever heard that? Yeah. We're going to get to that in a sec. A regressive tax system is one in which the less income you have, the more you're paying in taxes as a share of your income. So here's the rub on this scenario. When we talk about progressive, proportional, or regressive, it's not just about income taxes, right? Because we all pay more than just income taxes. We pay sales taxes, we pay property taxes. And it turns out that when you combine those, that's what the picture really is. So our income tax structure in most states is relatively progressive, meaning as people get more money, they're ultimately going to pay more in taxes as a share of their income. Property taxes tends to be relatively flat to modestly regressive, but there's this bump that happens for middle income households in property taxes. And then sales tax are hugely regressive. So a state like Florida that has no income tax, people at the bottom of the income ladder pay 12 times more in state and local taxes as a share of their income compared to the top 1%. Wow. Right? Whereas Maine actually, we're almost to a proportional system. We passed a threshold a couple of years ago. This is thanks in part to work that we did at the Maine Center for Economic Policy, where the bottom 40% of households no longer pay more in taxes as a share of their income than the top. But the point being, when we think again about how do we restructure our tax code, you can't just think about one piece of it. You've got to look at the whole picture. And sometimes when we work with lawmakers in Augusta and also in DC, we have to remind them at times. Because what do you hear people talk about in Maine when they talk about our tax code? They say, oh, we need to reduce our top income tax rate. That's what a lot of people will say. But it turns out, or we need to get to a flat tax. Well, a flat income tax on top of a sales and property tax system means that ultimately we wind up with a regressive tax system. Okay? Y'all with me? I love it. We got a room full of future tax advocates. So here's the other rub, though, with this, because sometimes a tax doesn't get called a tax, right? So one of the things I love about the messaging around the reconciliation bill that's currently happening is you'll hear the talking point for proponents of it, which is, oh, if we don't do this, everybody's taxes are going to go up. Bull malarkey. Because what's happening right now that seems very mercurial from day to day, it's gotten a taco moniker attached to it. Tariffs. So the tariff regime is a tax. And there's been really good analysis, and it's ranged because every day it's changing, right? We all know this game. But at its peak, the tariffs were projected to increase costs for households an average of $4,900 a year. Now it's down, now that things have sort of gone down a little bit and there's some resettling negotiations, some maybe quid pro quo kind of deals happening on the sides, it's now projected to be about $950 a year per average household. But keep that number in the back of your head for a hot sec. Okay, so that's your overview, but wait. It turns out that, anybody know who Adam Smith is? Who is he? Who was he? Yeah, fair enough. He's an economist.
He was a British economist, political philosopher, and his, Christ, it's been too long.
Yes, yes.
I'm sorry, it's been too long.
So the shortcut here is he's a philosopher. Good on you for getting that piece. Viewed as the father of capitalism, right? He basically had the view and the perspective that the best economic system we can have is one in which people are acting in their self-interest. But even he came to the conclusion that even under a capitalist regime, it's not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion. And the reason being is that he appreciated that the best capitalist system was actually one that was bolstered by public investments in roads, in educational systems, and where the rule of law prevailed to provide a predictable and stable environment in which to do business and transact trade. And one of the ways in which you do that is by making sure you raise enough revenue to make those investments. So the father of capitalism himself, not only basically, in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, says we need a progressive tax system. Okay? So now here's your pop quiz. And for those of you who are in Knox County, you got to keep it quiet. So who here what was the highest top tax rate we've had in this country? So in our income tax code, yes?
90% in 1950s.
All right, can I get another? Higher than 90. I like the hedging. That's good, at 90%. Okay, and then what about the lowest? What's been our lowest top marginal tax rate? Any guesses?
Current?
10%? Reagan era, okay. All right.
Are you counting all the loopholes that people get?
Oh.
'Cause don't some people pay 0% because of all the loopholes?
Oh, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. Okay, good. So
17% with Lincoln.
okay, yes. You people are not taking it easy on me today. So I'm going to say our reference point is from 1920 forward. Okay, so we'll leave Abe on the side here. But yes, it was actually before 1920. It was as low as I think 6% at one point in time. Yes, in the back. Did you have one?
I was saying we didn't always have it.
Exactly. Yes. Okay. Wow. Okay. I gotta revise this, Karen, for this kind of group. You guys are on it. I love it. So, in the time period that I'm referencing, you didn't know that I had that behind my back. Yes, in 1945 was when we've had the highest top tax rate, and it was actually 94%. That was applied to taxable income above $200,000. Now, as we all know, inflation happens, so $200,000 in 1945 isn't the same as $200,000 today. Anybody want to guess what $200,000 in 1945 is in equivalent dollar terms today? It's 3.5 million. Okay? So, if you were a millionaire in 1945, you wound up paying an additional $752,000 in taxes because of this top tax rate. The other thing, this will blow your mind for a hot sec. In 1945, there were also 23 brackets. Yeah. So the lowest, and this is compliments of trickle-down Reagan economic theory, was in 1989, 28%. Interestingly, only 2 brackets at that time. So the top bracket kicked in at $30,930. So if you had income above that threshold, you were paying the 28%, the top marginal rate, which meant that if you were a millionaire, you were paying an additional $271,000 in taxes. So here's where it gets fun for me, and now we're going to get rolling, is here's what's happened with the top tax rate since, again, the 1920s. So you've got, I skipped a beat, 25%, it was a little lower in 1931. But anybody remember this whole Gilded Age thing? Right? Yeah. And then all of a sudden it bumps up. Well, why did it bump up? We had a war. We actually, guess what, folks? The largest governmental entity in this country is the military. And so in 1945, obviously we're high. It remained high. And here's what's important when we start talking about the tax code is Democrats and Republicans alike are equal opportunity offenders in terms of efforts to reduce taxes over time. Now, we won't blame them by themselves because there were other interests that were propelling them in that direction. But, you know, the Johnson era cuts took us down a notch. And then it really got supercharged under President Reagan. So down to 28%. But even President Obama, put forward tax cuts. But here's the difference. His tax cuts were targeted to working class people. So even though they were more costly than the Bush tax cuts, they actually benefited working people more. Whereas many of the Republican tax cuts, ultimately the beneficiaries are the people at the top. So this is a really important thing to get your head around, though, is that Democrats and Republicans alike have been equal opportunity offenders in propping up a tax code that not only does not raise enough revenue to allow us to achieve our highest aspirations as a country, but ultimately has been complicit in boosting inequality and eroding the fabric of our country and our democracy. So here's why I draw that conclusion in part. So we look at income inequality and we see that it is at historic levels. So what this chart represents, and this is data that comes from two economists, Piketty and Says, that some of you all may have seen in the last several years. But wealth, this reflects the share of income that is held by the top 10%. So the top 10%, the wealthiest 10%, or the richest 10% of households, what share of national income do they hold? Well, you'll see, again, the Gilded Age, it got pretty high, right? And then the Depression came and the war and this idea that we were going to sort of try to build out the middle class. And so it turned out that we did a good job of retaining income share and distributing it. Now, arguably, this could be even better, right? But then look what's happened in the last 40 years. We've supercharged it. We are at the highest levels of income inequality in this country that we have ever been at, not counting slavery.
When you talk about income inequality, is that the annual income that somebody or some family or some person obtains, or is that the actual amount of personal wealth that they have?
So it is not wealth. If we looked at wealth inequality, this would be even more dramatic.
That's why I thought it's worse, right?
Yeah, significantly worse, right? Because we've allowed accumulation of wealth over generations, and we've actually made it easier through loopholes in the tax code for that to occur. So yeah, this is just talking about income levels. Yes.
So I'm a little confused with the difference between wealth and income. This is the income that's coming in, but wealth means that's what you've already retained. This is on top of.
Right. So, you know, I earn $50,000 a year. I live in a house that's worth $200,000, right? So my wealth is $200,000 plus whatever the balance is between my $50,000 and what I owe, right? So say I had 25, so I'm $225,000 for the better. But my income at the end of the day is the $50,000, again, less any obligations. So, yeah, so the wealth picture is dramatically more. But here's what I want to get to on this, which is, look what happens when you put the two together. Now, admittedly, correlation isn't causality, right? But it's pretty hard not to look at this and appreciate that over time, the forces that have prompted us to deliver a tax code that ultimately favors the wealthy and the rich is very much tied to the rules of how our economy gets structured. So in the parlance of monopoly, my brothers are charging a heck every time I land on any property they own, and they are dipping into the bank and taking $2 for every $1 I give them, right? So this stuff is really key. But coming back to the question that came up earlier about, well, wait a second, aren't there other things? Is this really what people pay? And this is a very good point, right? So top tax rate is 37%. That's the top marginal tax rate, which means that's what you pay on income above that threshold. But nobody actually pays that as a share of that's not their what's called effective tax rate. So some of you all have heard Warren Buffett talk about the fact that he pays less in taxes as a share of his income than his secretary. Well, why is that? Well, one of the reasons why it is because of how we treat income you earn through work versus income you earn from just being rich and having that money in the market, churning off profits and income for you, right? So the capital gains, going back to that example of a couple that's earning $150,000 a year through work, what are they paying in taxes again? They're paying about $22,000 in taxes. But if that $150,000 came solely from capital gains, so money they had in the market, they would pay a little bit less than $8,000 a year in taxes, right? Now, if I'm a working person, I'm thinking, wait a second, we should be flipping this equation. Like, if you're doing nothing and earning this kind of money, you should be the one paying more, not the other way around. But it gets even more crazy when you think about what's happening with our ability to pass wealth from one generation to the next. Because if you happen to be the inheritor of a portfolio of investments that then you cash out on, and it happened to have appreciated by $150,000, which gives you a $150,000 profit, you are paying 0 taxes on that money. So even better for you not to work and to inherit wealth. Right? Yes.
I was just going to say, I didn't realize there was such a high tax rate in the past, and like from the, 45
Yeah.
to 89. I had no idea it was that high. And I just find it interesting, like the age people look back on, especially, white male America as the golden age of America.
Yeah.
Is like the 50s and the 60s, and like, oh, we were all doing so well, but here they had such a high tax rate. And they claim now that, oh, it's the taxes that are getting us in this awful place right now.
Right. Well, the way I think about that too is just, so what this clearly allows for, right, is significant investment in people and communities. So, the GI Bill was a very important part of that story of like American prosperity and sort of the American dream. We subsidized the heck out of home ownership during this period, right? And so the thing that brings it home for me in those terms is when you look at the cost of things over time and how they've gone up, You know, we all know that health insurance costs has gone up tremendously, right? We all know that the cost of food has gone up, not as much as health insurance. We all know that the cost of housing has gone up. The one that's gone up the most is higher ed. It's not even close. So my dad getting that $2,000 scholarship, you know, that allowed him to go to a small rural college in North Carolina, if you inflated those $2,000 in today's terms and then said, can you go to college on that? There's no way. And when I talked to my dad about his experience, he said, point blank, when we first started talking about this, he says, there is no way I would have gone to college if I had to take out a loan. He never would have done it. He never would have done it. So that's yes, I think that's what people need to understand. That we can't have good things if we're not willing to pay for good things. And what we've done is we've somehow convoluted ourselves into thinking if we actually give these nice, beneficent people more, they'll give good things for the rest of us. Right? And that's just not the way it works. And the other piece of this is there are other ways in which the tax code is being rigged. Right? So what corporations are paying and all the loopholes that they have available to them. The shell game that happens in terms of, you know, I'm going to put this asset in this foreign country and therefore keep it from being taxed, all that kind of stuff. And so where that gets us is a place that after the 2017 tax bill went through, what do you think all these companies have in common?
Paid no taxes.
Every single one of these companies paid no taxes in at least 1 year after the 2017 tax bill went through. Right? So you got AT&T, hundreds of billions in profits.
We're the airlines, we bailed them out too.
Yeah. I couldn't get them all on here. But you know, you got AT&T, hundreds of billions in profits. Their effective tax rate in the last several years has been 3%. Yeah. You know, Citigroup, the bank, you know, their effective tax rate was less than 5%, but also they're the beneficiaries of the termination of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, who had a similar case in which they were looking at their banking practices, not unlike what was happening with Wells Fargo. Well, Wells Fargo paid a significant share of money to resolve that suit. So not only is Citigroup benefiting from a tax code that is beneficial to them, but they are now benefiting from the rules being structured in such a way that they are allowed to get further ahead and further enrich their CEOs and their shareholders. Yes?
Is the argument that any of these people would not be able to conduct business if they didn't have these benefits?
I think the typical argument on this stuff, right, is if you raise costs for businesses, then it's gonna cost jobs. Right? That is pretty much the standard trickle-down theory. Like anything that hurts business is going to hurt you because you're going to lose your job, because if we tax that business, they're not going to have that money to pay you to bring you on. Well, I'm sorry, but that money is not going to workers. And in fact, we'll get to that in a second. Sorry, I should have warned you. I didn't have a trauma rating on this slideshow. But they are not. They are in Washington, D.C. at the inauguration, correct. So these are some of the fine folks who were at the inauguration. I think you know many of them. We got our friend Jeff Bezos and Elon, and the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, and then this guy over here, certain guy named Mark Zuckerberg. And, you know, so it is little wonder that these folks are rolling up big time for an administration that's ultimately going to not only change the rules of the game in such a way that allows them to continue to have unfettered sort of free reign over what they're doing, but also pads their pockets. At the same time that their success, going back to that 50s period, right, is built on the backs of research and development, infrastructure, and workforce that were made possible by the generations that came before us who paid it forward to develop those assets. So they are leveraging public resources for private profit without paying their fair share to make sure that future generations similarly benefit from the advances and opportunity that we can provide for everyone. So the thing that brings this home most for me is when you look at this sort of divide over time between what workers are getting paid, even though they continue to be increasingly productive. So look at this. It's not disconnected from the same time frame in which the tax code got dramatically changed. So part of my point in this conversation is the more resources that are getting funneled in one direction, the more power those people have to further fix the rules of the game so that they continue to get more resources. That's the loop, right? And as a consequence, the rest of us are getting left behind. So let's put a finer point on this. This is one of my favorite graphics that one of my colleagues at Maine Center for Economic Policy developed. So, here we have our average worker, Lego guy here. We have a CEO in 1975, golden retriever, very good, kind CEO. And then we have Paul Bunyan. Don't mess with Paul. So in 1975, I should have asked you this question. CEO pay was 25 times higher than the average worker. So that's roughly a Lego to the golden retriever, right? You know where this is going. In 2024, CEO pay was 300 times higher than the average worker on average. So that's 2 Paul Bunyans. There's our poor little Lego guy. Please don't step on me, Paul, right? And when you look at it combined, I mean, Paul's looking at the CEO in 75 and saying, boy, you really screwed up. You could have rigged the rules so much better. What took you so long, right? But this, more than anything, I think makes it very clear, whether you're talking about the tax code and how we're taxing earned income versus unearned income, whether you're talking about the rules of the game that structure the ability of unions to advocate for fair wages, whether you're talking about the regulatory environment in which new technologies get developed, or what companies are asked to pay for riding on the back of public infrastructure and public investment. It all ultimately creates an incentive structure where those at the top are getting more and those not even at the bottom, in the middle, are falling further and further behind. Okay, so on that happy note, let's go to another happy note. So this is the point at which we transition to talking about the current state of play. But I think you've gotten the basic gist of where I'm headed here. So here's my next trauma warning. More trauma's coming, okay? And then we'll get on to the better stuff. So beware the 3 C's, chaos, corruption, and cuts. What do I mean by that? Well, I think we all have a sense of this. But under the current administration, there has been so much that has happened that is affecting not only our economy, but also our sense of what's possible as a nation, and ultimately people's lives. So when we think about the chaos, well, I think this is a great sampling of what the chaos is meaning to Maine. So we have a president who, jokingly or not, said he wants to make Canada the 51st state, puts tariffs on the line. Guess who lives next to Canada? Us. Well, we are already seeing the implications of that. So this is visitation to Maine from Canadians, and you can see year over year, in January of this year, we were at 4%. So we were slightly up from where we were the year before. It has gone down dramatically. So we are down 35% in terms of Canadian visitors to Maine. Now, when I was down in DC, actually, in, I think it was late January, early February, and I was actually in Senator King's office, and a guy who runs a hotel down in southern Maine was in there at the same time, and he said, Senator King, I have to tell you, and it was the day after, or right around when Trump had both made a statement about the 51st state, but more importantly about tariffs being applied to Canada. And the hotel owner said, I have already had 4 cancellations from Canadian visitors who have been with me for over 10 years. So that is one way in which the chaos is sort of viewed in Maine, but you also see, the DOGE cuts are really taking a bite for different people in different communities. We had the opportunity to work with some people who worked in the VA, and it turns out that, you know, for all the talk about honoring veteran services, this administration is undercutting their access to health care in multiple ways. And I was at a press conference a couple of weeks ago with a veteran who said, my wait times now to get seen have more than doubled. I don't know who to call anymore. And so I think there's a lot of examples. The research and development, what's happening there in terms of pulling back on our capacity to do research and development, it's just created this very uncertain environment. So now let's talk about corruption.
Question.
Yes?
So when one thinks of the VA cuts, a lot of us think, well, that's gonna be rough on veterans. But my understanding is that they're talking about having veterans find healthcare in the private sector, which in Maine is already strained.
Right.
And so it's really gonna affect everybody's access to healthcare.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, we know this, right? Anything that undercuts people's access to healthcare, you can't choose when you're sick. And at some point, you need the thing I've always really just drives me to distraction is the coffee can. What do I mean? Go to your general store, so-and-so got cancer, so-and-so had a car accident. Contribute to the coffee can. Now it's a GoFundMe thing, right? But that coffee can exercise for me has always been like fingernails on a chalkboard, because you can't decide when you're going to get sick and when you're going to need medical care. And if you don't have health insurance, it does. Somebody's got to pick up the tab, and we all wind up paying. So it's in our collective interest to cover as many people as possible. We should be covering everybody, because that's the best way to ensure that we are managing those needs and also most effectively and efficiently paying for them. So yeah, you're right. When veterans are losing access to health care, which they will through Medicaid cuts, because it turns out that they don't just get all their health care through the VA, the people who we've expanded Medicaid to, they're going to start showing up as uncompensated care, or they're going to go without and be less healthy. And we know from our experience in Maine, when we looked at Medicaid expansion, that people were dying because they didn't have access to health care. That definitely did not sit well with lawmakers when we pointed that out to them. But you can't deny it, right? I mean, how many of us have a relative or someone in our lives who delayed going to see a healthcare practitioner, and then when they found out what the issue was, it was too late to do anything to materially alter the course of that disease? That happens way too much. And the main reason it happens is because of people's inability to pay for that care. All right, so on that happy note, we are now going to talk about corruption. So we now have a much more transparent pay-to-play system. So how much do you think it costs to pause an SEC fraud lawsuit? Or maybe secure a pardon for tax crimes for your child? Preserve business relations, or secure tariff concessions and favorable treatment? Well, here are some great examples, and if you read the New York Times, you may have come across this recently. To pause an SEC fraud lawsuit, it turns out there's a range. The high water mark was set by Justin Sun, who is a crypto venture person, who contributed $75 million to Trump's crypto. And after he did this, guess what? The SEC paused the cryptocurrency fraud suit that was in place against him. He subsequently donated an additional $40 million to the Trump administration for their kind and generous way in which they're building out the crypto industry. But it turns out $1 million might also be sufficient. So there's a new club that's been established by John Jr. in Georgetown, the executive branch, which tells you everything you need to know if you want access. And the twins, for those of you who saw The Social Network, they're the Winklevoss twins, Cameron and Tyler. And they similarly bought into this club, which is $1 million buy-in. And guess what? Their SEC fraud lawsuit is now paused. To secure the pardon for tax crimes, this was a very well-intentioned mom who was looking out for her son. Elizabeth Fago, who spent $1 million at a dinner for MAGA Inc., which is the political action committee for President Trump. And after purchasing her $1 million ticket for dinner, and I'm sure it was an amazing dinner, her son, who had been convicted of tax crimes, was subsequently pardoned. All this is in full view. Preserving business relations. Amazon. Remember that guy? Amazon. Well, they bought the rights to Melania Trump's documentary. And it turns out that she got to keep more than 70% of this fee. And they bought them for $40 million, which industry execs in Hollywood all said, there is no way anybody would pay that much for documentary rights. Maybe 10, maybe 20, a stretch to 30, but 40 is crazy. So, 10 to 20 million keeps you in the game in terms of preserving your business relationships. And then securing tariff concessions or favorable treatment. Our energy policy, who benefits by our insistence on continuing to drill, baby drill, and rely on fossil fuels? It is not necessarily the Western states. It is Qatar and Saudi Arabia and places like that. So a Boeing 747 seems like a pretty cheap date for those kinds of things. My favorite, though, is Vietnam sort of got hip to this tariff game, and they said, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to build a $1.5 billion golf complex in honor of President Trump. And guess what? Now we're in the game talking about the tariff regime that's happening for Vietnam. And then the last example of this, and believe me, there are plenty more, is the Trump Hotel in Serbia, where somehow there was paperwork that magically appeared that allowed them to completely obliterate a cultural heritage site in order to build the newest Trump Hotel in Serbia. Yes. So that's your corruption. And now let's talk about the cuts. So what is being cut in this reconciliation bill, which some of you have heard is the quote-unquote big, beautiful bill? It's the big, ugly bill. For Maine, there are a couple of things that really stand out. First of all, nutrition assistance. So 31,000 Mainers will likely lose their health coverage, or their nutrition assistance, and that includes 1 in 10 veterans as a result of the current budget bill that's making its way through Congress. So imagine at your local Memorial Day parade pulling out 1 out of every 10 veterans and saying, sorry, we just took away your food assistance. I don't think you would want to do that. I don't think Susan Collins would want to do that. I'd really like to see her try. I don't think Angus King or any of our other representatives would want to do that. And so we really need to understand what the impacts of these changes are on people. Similarly, with health coverage, the cuts to Medicaid, 34,000 Mainers will lose access to health coverage, in addition to the cost increases that come about as a result of the premium tax credits that we talked about earlier, right? So some couples could see significant increases in their costs as a result of that. Clean energy. There is an early projection, I don't know that these are the most current numbers, that Maine could expect to lose roughly $100 million annually in clean energy investments. And that will also result in increased rates for ratepayers as much as like $15 on average per month. So here's an administration that came in promising to lower costs, and at every turn they are increasing cost. And this is a clear example as well about where the future for our country is at risk because of these short-sighted investments that are backwards looking in terms of where we're trying to get to. Education, yes?
When do these things start to come home to people? When do they go into effect?
Well, the bill hasn't passed yet, and so that's our chief hope, is that if people understand what's at play and what the impacts might be, that they might actually rise up and say, wait a second, this makes no sense. But some of these things will go into effect next year, as early as next year, and some of these things are sort of a year or two delayed of when they go into effect. The other thing I just want to say about the clean energy piece is the amount of this investment. What it would mean is it would mean about 1,500 megawatts of lost production. And that roughly is the amount of energy you need to sustain about 750,000 households' energy consumption. So when you think about our future energy horizon and stability, that's a very important piece. Yes?
I was just going to say, will you share this slideshow, this presentation with us? Because I think these statistics are really good, succinct ways to, call our representatives.
Yep.
And say, I'm concerned about this.
Yes. Yeah. I will happily share this, and more importantly, I will direct you to places where you can find all this good information. And then the education piece, there's going to be increased costs for current and future borrowers. They're going to change the game on people who already have college loan debt in terms of what they have to do to repay and remain in good standing with the federal government. At the same time that they're going to reduce eligibility for Pell Grants and make it more costly for people to go to college. So these are just some of the impacts for Maine. Again, Mainers hold a collective $6.5 billion in student loan debt. There are 190,000 borrowers in the state of Maine currently who potentially will be impacted by this. You want to know this blew my mind a couple of years ago because we did some research on this at Maine Center for Economic Policy. One of the groups that is seeing the greatest increase in student loan debt, guess who they are? Veterans certainly have, but they actually, if they're in long enough, they get the GI Bill, so even they and their children potentially can benefit. It's grandparents. It's older Mainers who are co-signing or taking out loans to support their grandchildren and going. So people who are over the age of 60, 65 are some of the largest areas of growth for student loan debt. Which again goes back to this sort of narrative about how we've built an economy where historically in the tail end of when things were kind of okay for middle class white households, in order for them to retain that grasp on that lifestyle that they'd become accustomed to, they had to adapt, right? So one of their adaptations was women went to work, and then the household increased the combined number of hours that it worked. In Maine, there's a period of time of over about 15 years where the combined household work effort increased by about 500 hours. And then families stopped saving, right, for future investments. So they stopped saving for retirement or higher education. And then they started to forego certain consumption or use their credit card. And then the 2008 recession happens and it just blows it out of the water. So no wonder working class people feel stretched and on a tightrope at every turn and are just pissed off at our politicians for not doing anything about it. But the reality and the challenge is the situation they are in is a situation that has been 45 years in the making. And helping people connect those dots is really important. Yes?
What's the obsession with the administration in attacking education? One of the things that's most devastating to me is the statistic that 54% of the country reads below a 6th grade level. I mean, how do we progress if education is not available?
Yeah, this could be a whole different conversation.
I'm sorry.
No. But I.
Heavily on this.
No, well, I'll tell you the thing that lodges for me is if you're not willing to put the resources on offer necessary to deliver a quality system, then no wonder that system is not working properly, right? We have publicly subsidized low-wage work in this country. And where is it most applied? Education and healthcare. Teachers It's not a private marketplace. I mean, it is at private schools and that kind of thing. But our public school system, what we're trying to do with our public school system in this country is like unprecedented, right? Universal public education. But we have basically said to, and I see it because I coach, I have kids who go off to college. You know, I mean, my son actually, this is very funny because he just graduated from Tufts and he's going into the teacher program. He's got a 5th-year master's where he's going to go into teaching. And I said to my wife the other day, I was like, you know, it's so interesting because the reality is his lifetime earnings potential is going to be forever diminished because he's going into a field that is undervalued and where people are underpaid. Meanwhile, a number of his classmates who similarly would love to go into education, but at the end of the day, either because they didn't have the stability in their own lives or they just wanted the creature comforts too much, are going off into finance, right? So we have created an incentive structure where some of our best and brightest talent, I'm not pumping up my son here, I'm just saying in general, right, are sort of, there's a real disincentive to go down that path. Caregivers. I mean, we have worked with caregivers who have said to us, look, I can now go to Walmart and start a job at Walmart and get paid just as much as I currently get paid without being screamed at, without the physical challenges, and without the psychic load of this job. But I stay in this job because I am a caregiver and I see the impact of this work in people's lives. But we shouldn't have a system in which somebody delivering quality care is solely driven by their commitment while they are continuing to be underappreciated and underpaid. So, okay, thank you for that opportunity to make that tributary. Okay, so all this happens, back to the original point of this presentation, right, to give tax cuts to the ultra-rich and large corporations. So why are people losing health care? Why are they losing their nutrition assistance? Why are we losing our investments in clean energy in the future of this country? Why are we raising costs for education? Oh, it's so we can give the richest 400 households $800 million a year. That's the way we build a strong economy, people. Get with the program. The top 1%, they're going to get 25% of the benefit, which is approximately $126 billion in 2026. The state economy in Maine is $75 billion. So imagine if we just took all the money that we accumulate in Maine and we just ship it out to the top 1%. We're still giving them less money than they're going to get from President Trump. And here's the other rub. This wealth transfer from poor and working class people to wealthy people is also a wealth transfer from rural people to people living in Silicon Valley and in the Gold Coast of New York. So that's part of it. And then, oh yeah, I would go back, but it's too many slides to go back through. Our friends who were at the inauguration, they're going to get a one-time windfall of $75 billion. There's an uber wonky provision in the reconciliation bill that basically is allowing them a look back on research and development investments that is going to allow them to take this additional money. Yeah. So that's part of it. But don't be deceived, okay? So I share this reluctantly, but I just want to share it so you have some more facts. This is modeled by some of our colleagues in Washington at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. And what they did is they said, okay, we're just looking at the tax provisions of the current House reconciliation bill, and we're going to model how much Mainers get in tax cuts. So this is what that picture looks like for Maine. So if you're in the bottom 20% of households, you're earning less than $37,000 a year, you're going to get a tax cut of $150 on average, okay? If you're in the top 1%, which in Maine is earning above $817,000 a year, you're going to get an average tax cut of $37,540. That's the average, okay? There are households who are getting way more than that. So this gives you that sort of picture. But here's the deal. Anybody at this level or lower, at the end of the day, this becomes a wash or worse, right? Because, oh, I'm sorry, this lovely middle-income household who's trying to get their child to college, sorry, we just outsource those costs, we push them down to you, the individual, right? So now you're going to pay more, so we might have taken away your tax cut for that. We took away your health care. We made you pay more for your health care, right? Like, all this stuff gets washed out pretty quickly, and at the end of the day, the people who are still standing, who are still getting richer, that income thing goes higher and higher, is at the top. I don't think I have to convince you all of that. But the other thing we're doing is it turns out that for all the cutting they're doing, they're still not paying for these tax cuts. So they're going to borrow to pay for these tax cuts. I mean, this is better than my brothers could do. Right? I mean, yes, I am sure they slipped a few out of the bank into their pockets, but this is a whole nother level, because what we're talking about here is we're going to mortgage our future and our ability to absorb any unexpected emergencies in our economy with these tax cuts, because they're not paid for. So when you look at historically our debt to GDP ratio in the United States, the highest levels we've been at has been 2020 and in 1946 or so. 120% or so, a little over 120%. Most economists say you want to be kind of in this range, responsibly. You want to be in the sort of 50 to 80% range. Ideally, you're sort of more in the 60% range. If this proposal goes through, it's going to take us order of magnitude somewhere to the 180% range by 2054. So what does that mean? Well, oh, I'm sorry, now we don't have enough money. Now we've got to make cuts elsewhere in the federal budget, but we won't touch defense, which, by the way, the interest on this debt alone is more than the entirety of our defense budget. We've just crossed that threshold. And so maybe we're going to have to go after Social Security and Medicare. This is a setup of the highest order. What they're doing in the short term, though, is they're pushing more of the cost down to states. So they're going to take about $400 million out of money that they're currently sending to Maine to pay for health care and food assistance and force the state to pick up those costs. Or the state has to eliminate those services. Yes?
So when Governor Newsom recently said that they might possibly stop sending money to the federal government, what, I mean, is that a real possibility, and what would that do?
So did Governor Mills.
Right, what would that do to the state, to the federal government, to the rest of us?
Yeah, so what Governor Newsom is appropriately pointing out, right, is that California contributes more in taxes than they get in return.
Yeah.
We are actually on the receiving end of that bargain, right? We get $1.67 for every dollar we pay in taxes. Part of the reason for that, right, is because we have an older population, so we have a higher percentage of people who are on Social Security and Medicare. But we are also a low wealth state, so we're not putting as much money in the till that way. I think it's a very provocative statement, but I don't know how you actually do that in a realistic way, right? But I think he's completely correct to point out. I mean, they're the 5th largest economy in the world, California, right? Or something along those lines. Yeah. So I think that's where the sort of retribution game starts to become really problematic. There is no coherent vision for what they are trying to do in terms of building an economy that works for everyone. It is completely about pursuing the whims and the fanciful thinking. I mean, the fact that some lawmakers with a modestly straight face are trying to claim that, oh, these tax cuts are going to boost the economy and economic activity so much that they're going to pay for themselves. How many times have we heard this lie? So that's where that stands. But the increased cost in Maine is vitally important as well. So, okay, let's bring it home now, because you guys have been great. And I've been prattling on a long time. Just insert the quarter, you never know how long it's going to go for. Okay, but the reality is, in Maine, there were efforts to play this game here too. right? So we had the governor who said he was Trump before Trump was Trump, and one of his signature policies was income tax cuts, which are costing us roughly $895 million per year in lost revenue. So when you hear people talk about our shortfall at the state level, well, if our tax code were the same as it was in 2010, we actually would have a surplus. So tax policy matters, right? These cuts primarily benefited wealthy Mainers. More than 50% went to the top. And they also shifted costs to education and services to towns. So one of the ways in which they paid for these tax cuts was by not paying 55% for education, K-12 education, by actually reducing the amount of money that was going to towns for local services through revenue sharing. Okay? But, yeah. Was there a question? Yes.
I have a very stupid question, probably.
No such thing.
Yeah, well, just here. If that has cost us that much money and it was LePage's tax cuts, he's been gone for quite a while, and we've had all three branches of government have been Democrats for quite a while. Why haven't those tax cuts been undone?
That's such a
Was that a
good
stupid question?
That might be the smartest question. I mean, some could argue it's a no-brainer question, but I'm going to get to that in a hot sec. Okay? If I do not answer that question, you come back to me. Okay? Because we're going to go there. Now, despite this, we have managed to do some good things in Maine, in part because of the money that was made available through federal support through COVID, right? So we've made progress in spite of these things. So we now have 172,000 Maine children are eligible for free school meals. The completely transformative policy. Going back to your education question, the other part of the answer to your question is we increasingly are making schools the repository of social service delivery and addressing all the ills that are playing out in our economy, right? An under-resourced household with toxic stress in that household is going to set a kid up to not be ready to learn, but to have a lot of need for remediation before they can even get to that place. And that is being borne by our education system as well. But we've managed to expand healthcare coverage to 100,000 people. We've made a $100 million investment in affordable housing, and now through Free Community College, we've got 17,000 kids who are getting a debt-free education. And I can tell you, again, from my coaching experiences, there are kids that I work with who would have been like my dad. They wouldn't have gone on to get higher education. But because of this Free Community College thing, they have the aspiration, and now they have the opportunity. These are great. They're being put at risk. Now, they're being put at risk for two reasons. One is what's happening at the federal level, right? Federal funds flowing into Maine account for 1 out of every $5 in our economy. One of the things that Governor LePage failed at was understanding and appreciating the impact of federal funds on Maine's economy so that he did not leverage those dollars. There was money left on the table for all sorts of things. Support for caregivers of Alzheimer's patients, health care for people, educational opportunities for kids. $2.5 billion he left on the table. We wrote a paper about it when Governor Mills was running for office the first time. She called us up. She said, I want to understand this. And she has done everything she can to maximize federal funds. And the results are clear. Under LePage, recovering from the Great Recession, we had the slowest recovery of almost every other state in this country. We were at the bottom of the pack in terms of recovering jobs lost. There were parts of rural Maine that had a period of economic decline that was longer than what they experienced during the Great Recession. Or Depression, sorry, not Great Recession, the Depression, right? Under Mills, our recovery post-COVID was actually one of the fastest. And part of the reason for that was leveraging. Okay, so this stuff's at risk. The other reasons it's at risk, though, goes back to your question, which is in order to have nice things, we have to pay for nice things. And one of the ways we can pay for nice things is by making sure we raise the revenue to do so. And honestly, one of the things that really is very challenging in the work that we do sometimes is when we have to convince Democrats that taxes and talking about tax policy and raising revenue is actually a winning strategy. We know it. Raising taxes on millionaires is hugely popular among Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike because they know the economy's been rigged, right? So we need to get them off the dime that way. Okay, so now we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to finish because you all have been great, and I'm overstaying my welcome. So the current state of the budget, happily, the bulk of the budget's been dealt with at the state level, which means that our government's not going to shut down. The services that we have are going to remain in effect. But there are a few things that are still at risk. So free community college is currently not funded. This is what they're talking about in the legislature. Are we going to continue free community college? They got 2 weeks to figure this out. Okay? Then how are we going to pay for it? Turns out they're going to have to raise taxes to pay for it. But we have a governor who says, I'm not raising taxes. And then when she says, okay, I'm not raising taxes, but I am going to offer a budget proposal to raise taxes, and the taxes that I'm offering up are ambulance service fees, streaming fees, taxes on pharmaceuticals, and cigarette taxes. Do you think those are particularly popular or easy to talk about? We're rolling up and we're saying, how about taxing millionaires? Right? So the big one from my perspective is COLAs, going back to direct care workers. We're not raising their wages. This budget that the governor put forward is balanced in part by not increasing wages for direct care workers. The budget originally also undercut child care workers, but you know what happened with child care workers? They rolled up to the State House. In 3 days' time, they pulled together a work stoppage, and 350 of them showed up at the State House and rattled the cages of their lawmakers, and they pulled that out of the budget and funded it. Right? So cuts from Congress are going to hit, but they don't hit as badly in this next term. But all this stuff is really important to deal with. Okay, so the future is equal. So here's where I'm going to leave you for like action. Okay? First of all, we got to fight for our future and the future of generations to come. How do we do that? Well, get the facts. I'll put up, we've got some handouts in the back for folks who are interested. Maine Center for Economic Policy, we've got a great blog, so to your question about where can I get these sort of bite-sized information, a lot of that stuff is available on our website, but happy to work with you if you're interested. Karen Luthy's here, my colleague, and she's done a lot of great work with sort of advocates and activists in helping them submit like letters to the editor, helping them understand how to do testimony, those kinds of things. Contact your members of Congress again and again and again. You could have sort of pushed me over with a feather. When I was last down in D.C. Talking to Senator King, he said, keep the calls coming. He said, it helps me. And even though I know sometimes it can be dispiriting to feel like Susan Collins isn't listening, it does have an impact because it prompts her to stop and just think for half a second, right? So the more we can, now, the thing I will say about Senator Collins is obviously she does not tend to respond well when she feels backed into a corner. Not many of us do. So I think if you're able to keep it on the merits and potentially even tell your own story. You know, I had a local business owner in my neck of the woods, I live in Damariscotta, who she had ordered these boxes for her jewelry business. And she had tried to source them domestically, but she couldn't. And so she placed her order. And I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I'm going to just give you the numbers in round terms. And let's say it was a $50,000 order. Well, it turned out that between the time she placed the order and the time it shipped, the tariffs got applied from China. So her $50,000 order suddenly became a $125,000 order. There's no way you can run a business under those circumstances, right? That was the impact of the chaos. So if you have a story like that, share it with your friends, help connect the dots. And then show up and support organizations. I'm sure, you know, many of you all have been engaged in different things. The fact that you're here today supports this. But coming back to your question, it's funny, I changed this slide actually, because what it said before was, don't be a fancy Democrat. Okay? And the question I got when I shared that before to an indivisible group is, what is a fancy Democrat? Well, really what a fancy Democrat is somebody who somehow is buying into the trickle-down mythology and is really resistant to this idea that actually raising taxes is something that makes a lot of sense politically, it makes a lot of sense economically, and it makes a lot of sense morally. Even Adam Smith tells us it makes sense, right? So that's an important piece of it. Now, in terms of what you can do for the state fight, these first two in particular. If you have a cell phone, I'm just going to play this game for a hot sec. See this website right here, Mainers for Tax Fairness? Go to that website. I also have a palm card that's in the back that you can pick up, and it's got a QR code on it. It's very slick. Karen's amazing. And if you go to this website, we actually have, anybody familiar with 5 calls?
Yes.
So it's an app that sort of gives you the opportunity to sort of learn something on an issue and then take action if you want. We've created a 5 calls-like interface on our Mainers for Tax Fairness website. So go there, click the take action. What you will see is it's prompting people to call their legislators and advocate for the millionaire surcharge, which is LD 1089. And again, on the Mainers for Tax Fairness website, we have issue briefs and talking points on this particular policy. Similarly, the corporate income tax, 1879. So if you do one thing after today, aside from say, I don't remember a darn thing that guy said, please, 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 go to the Mainers for Tax Fairness website and get the information. You can enter your address. It'll populate with the numbers to call. And then Maine Center for Economic Policy is the sort of mothership where we have the uber wonky stuff, right? So that's where you go to get, why won't it let me go back? Reports and briefs and those kinds of things. So this is, and one thing I did bring today that you all might be interested in is we put out these legislative fact sheets that have a district by district breakdown of the number of people in poverty, the number of people on different programs, and those kinds of things. Those are in the back as well. But somehow I did not try to filibuster this talk. I did go probably longer than I should have. But let's just remember at the end of the day, we can tax the rich. They will still be rich. Okay? And the reason why this is important, that we get this in our DNA a little bit more, is like that game of Monopoly. And I had somebody I was talking to a couple months ago, and he said, you know, personally, I feel like where I'm at in this game of Monopoly is I know how it's going to end. And anybody who's played Monopoly, if you get to that point where you're like, please land me in jail, or please hit a community chest so I can survive for 2 more rounds, right? But his perspective was like, we know how this game's going to play out. We're just playing it out, and we're going to all get hung out to dry. I reject that premise. I fundamentally think we can move the pendulum back to a place where everybody can have a fair shot at a good life. And part of the way we have to start doing that is understanding the impacts of what's happening in DC on people in our lives and advocating for tax fairness at every turn. So with that, I will take any remaining questions, but that's it. So thank you all again for coming. And when we talked about this talk at MECEP, and again, Karen Luthi lives in Camden. She's someone to get in touch with if you're interested in getting more involved. We do have a sign-up sheet in the back if you're interested in getting on our listserv or our email list. But you know, I didn't really say that much about MECEP. There's also a fact sheet about us, but we're basically a backbone organization providing research and analysis to help people make better policy decisions. And we rely on folks like you all to engage in this fight with us. Karen, what do you have to say?
I just want to prompt you to give a little bit of information about the timing of the state budget, because that's happening like right now.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, you know, the timing could not be more critical on the state budget.
Yeah, if you do one thing coming out of this meeting, please, please, please call your state representative. Tell them you want to see revenue in the state budget and ideally a millionaire's tax. We are hearing that Democrats are resisting this in certain corners of the Democratic caucus, and I can't stress enough that we have to move beyond the old way of thinking about taxes as a liability politically and as something that hurts us economically, because until we do, we're going to just keep doing more of the same.
So what is, I'm not a full-time Maine resident, this is sort of small state, in some ways easier to get certain things up. What is the reason for the opposition to this millionaire's tax? I mean, other than the fact that millionaires are capable of lobbying and exerting influence on legislatures, but in terms of the whole legislature, why should the whole legislature be so opposed to bumping up taxes for people at a really high income level?
Not the whole legislature.
Right.
Let's be very clear about that.
Yeah, well, but there are Democrats who are also against it,
No.
right? So,
A small majority of people, we have a slim majority.
Yes,
It
yeah.
takes 3-4 Democrats to turn against it in that bill.
but to your question, I think so the Republican opposition to it is the old idea that, well, trickle down, but also government spending is too much already. We need to cut the programs, all that kind of stuff, which really just doesn't bear, oh, so you want to take away free community college because you don't think that's a good thing? Like, that's been an amazingly powerful thing. So that's part of it. We have a governor who took a no tax pledge. She said she wasn't going to raise taxes, and so she is a little bit she's great on a host of other issues, but on this issue, I think she comes from a period of time in which the sort of neoclassical, neoliberal view of economic policy suggested that taxes were a bad thing. So we're trying to help them appreciate and understand that actually this can be a winning issue. I mean, had President Trump signed off on a millionaire's tax in the big budget bill, I think that would have had tremendous consequence for where Democrats are politically. But he's continuing to hand this gift because, again, you saw Bernie Sanders supporters who voted for Trump. Why? Because they fundamentally felt like the system was rigged, and those two individuals were speaking to that concern. Now, their policy views differ diametrically, but we still have people in the legislature, that it's just, you can't, you just have to bring people along.
Garrett, can you also speak to the fact that the federal government can borrow the state government?
Yes.
We have to, by law,
Yes.
balance the budget, which makes it more difficult.
Yes.
And I do agree that there are people that do believe within our caucus the trickle-down theory, but the vast majority of Democrats do not.
Yes. Oh, yeah. No, that's right. And we're seeing that change. We have seen that change occur since 2010. We've done polling over time where the question is, do you believe that we should be cutting services and programs, or that we should be raising the resources we need to sustain those services and programs? And people increasingly are in the camp of, we need to raise the resources for that. I think at the long term, and I'm going to get in trouble with some of my team at MECEP for saying this, we do need to think about potentially revising our tax code in Maine, because I think where we're seeing historically the problem is around property tax. When property taxes start to represent about 42% of somebody's overall tax pie, we start to see some very challenging things unfold at the local level, and people start to get really resistant to raising taxes, period.
You address the myth, like New Hampshire not having an income tax, but they still have a pie, and they still have to pay for it, and they are taxed on the property, which is more regressive than the state. So there's this myth out there about Florida and Texas and so forth, that because we have an income tax, we're, exploiting our citizens and voters.
Right.
And that's just not correct.
Yeah. No. You had one more?
Is there, I know Maine is an older state, but how do you get younger people involved in this discussion?
They're here. Yeah, no. Yeah, look.
Maybe next time everybody has to bring a younger person.
Well, ironically, younger people appreciate more than not that the system is rigged. What we have to do for younger people is help them connect the dots to how the system got rigged in the first place and what they can do about it.
And to not give up hope or
You have
feel
a YouTube
helpless,
channel?
and let them know how they can connect the dots and
Yeah.
make a difference.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm very proud of, and Karen is partially responsible for this, is we have an amazing communications team at MECEP. We just did a real, short video on social media a couple weeks ago that was, I'm not on Medicaid, so why should I care about cuts to Medicaid? It's been viewed almost 100,000 times. It's been shared over 2,000 times. And we know that we are hitting a different demographic with that, I appear every week on CBS 13 out of Portland for a segment on Wednesday nights. And, you know, that's a different demographic.
I mean, because I'm not here full-time, and I'm looking at the conversations in my local election, which is coming up next week.
Yeah.
And I'm reading the things on the Facebook pages associated with it, and the debate seems to be over school costs and
Yeah.
taxes for their, you know, paying taxes for where you live, and the relative merit of staying in a system.
Yeah.
What are the results? Is it expensive? What's going on? I don't know where to begin in that discussion, but it seems like the greater good has to be foremost in your mind all the time.
Yeah, and the local property tax challenge is a tricky one. And we're seeing, you know, last year there were some school budgets that were rejected 3 times over before they passed. And, you know, that's, anyway, yes, it's tough.
Do you have a plan, because property tax funding schools is not really effective in
Yeah.
a lot of ways. Do you have a plan to fund education outside of the property tax?
That is one thing that we plan to work on once we get through this session. I mean, yeah, there's no question. Last question, people are filtering out, that's great. I know I've kept you longer than I should have, but
I was just gonna say.
I'm thrilled you're here.
I was just gonna say, as far as young people go, I think what Valerie says, help them not give up hope, because I know, like, I have a college-age daughter and her friends, and college-age kids, and, you know, a little older on lines. A lot of them feel like we just need to, you know, do away with the whole system.
Yeah.
Like, completely abandon capitalism, you know, like, go to a commune society or, you know, something.
Right.
You know, they're just like, we're done, you know?
Yeah.
And this, you know, connecting those dots of it doesn't, you don't have to completely abandon everything. You could go back to some of this is helpful.
Well, and honestly, for me, where that also becomes very much connected to this is the rules and regulations for how this system works can either prevent the kinds of communities and communal resourcing and sharing and opportunities that you're aspiring to from being able to happen in the first place. So one of the bills that we had that we worked on in the legislature is an anti-monopoly bill. And fundamentally what it's about is, right, these huge national chains set up shop in rural places. They undercut their local supermarket on the highest profit, highest margin, highest volume items, and basically cause a scenario in which that supermarket either has to shut down or it gets worse goods for the people in that community. And it's just a way of sort of gouging the economy. So, you know, then you're starting to see food deserts in these rural places. I mean, you can always get Coca-Cola, right? But it's really interesting to engage with lawmakers on this to say, hey, look, you've already acknowledged this is a problem in your community. How come you don't understand that the reason it's a problem is because the way the rules are structured means that there's unfair competition. I mean, every time our state chamber of commerce rolls up and advocates for business in Maine, I just want to say stop the identity theft, because they purport to be looking out for small mom and pop businesses on Main Street, but they are not doing that at all. In fact, in a lot of instances, they're actually increasing costs for those businesses because of the tax subsidies that they're advocating for the large companies. So that's, anyway, it's all related, right? So you're yawning, I hope.
Stretching, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think I should step aside. I'm happy to talk to folks afterwards. Appreciate you staying this long. Karen will critique me later, and I'm open to other critiques as well. But thank you, Valerie and the Waldo County Dems, for hosting. Okay.